couple of days have been an intensive Zoom experience for many of us. My classes have all been sidelined to Zoom. It's been an interesting experience, a rewarding experience, but I'm very glad to be here with you tonight. Our inclination in times of stress and times of trouble is to look to the Bible for parallels to our contemporary predicament. David Bernstein, in the first part of the class, mentioned the holiday of Sukkot as a holiday that gives us a sense of what it means to live with uncertainty. But of course, given that this is a time of year where we're preparing, albeit in a slightly different way than we usually do for the holiday of Passover, I think it's important to look to the sources that talk about Passover for possible parallels to our contemporary situation. And if we can pull up the first text that we're going to talk about. When we look at the description of the Passover in Egypt, which is in the Torah portion that we read, or were supposed to have read, for those of us who didn't have a minyan yesterday, we see a number of interesting details about the way that the Passover in Egypt is described. The people of Israel are supposed to take a lamb on the 14th day of the month. This is in verse 6. And all the assembled congregation shall slaughter it at twilight. They shall eat the flesh by the same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. So far, basically what we know, well, we don't serve the Passover sacrifice, but unleavened bread, bitter herbs, gathered together in our families. And now in verse 11, we have something a little different that we don't recognize from our own Passover seders. This is how you shall eat it: your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hands, and you shall eat it hurriedly. It is a Passover offering for the Lord. We don't usually eat our Passover Seder in a hurried fashion, unless somebody's rushing to get out the door and get home or go to sleep. We have our Seder in a fairly relaxed, calm way, rather than eating it in a hurried way as if we're rushing to go somewhere. And then as we continue reading the details, we see another detail that applies only in the Passover that they celebrated in Egypt and never again. In verse 22, take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, apply some of it to the basin, to the lintel, and to the two doorposts. None of you shall go outside the door of the house until morning. The Israelites are supposed to take the blood and paint their doorposts, and one of the things that it seems to symbolize is a warning not to go outside. Why shouldn't they go outside? For when the Lord goes through to smite the Egyptians, this is the night of the plague of firstborn, he will see the blood in the lintel and the two doorposts, and the Lord will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter and smite your house. Effectively, the plague of the firstborn is not something that affects only the Egyptians. Potentially, it affects the Israelites as well. And the only guarantee they have not to be struck down by the plague of the firstborn is to stay inside their homes. When the Lord sees the blood on the door, he will pass over, hence the name of the holiday, the door, and not let the destroyer enter your home. This is a very strange passage and raises a number of profound questions which we're going to be addressing in the course of the class. For example, why couldn't God simply smite the Egyptians and save the Israelites as he had done in the first 9 plagues? The Talmud Bavli addresses this issue in a very strange way, and this is the theme that we're going to talk about and address, again, in a kind of roundabout way in the course of the class. Rav Yosef taught, what is the meaning of that which is written, and none of you shall go outside the opening of his house until morning? Says Rav Yosef, once permission is granted to the destroyer to kill, it does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. There is a sense in which once the energy of the plague is loosed, all bets are off, anybody is fair game, and the only way that the Jews have, the only way that the Israelites have to save themselves from the plague is to stay inside, behind their doors, behind their houses, and God will pass over their houses only in that circumstance. I want to take some of the themes that we find in this section and explore them in an unusual way in what I call the prequel to the Exodus. The Exodus story actually repeats many times throughout history. In fact, we mention this at the Seder. In every generation, we have to see ourselves as though we were leaving Egypt. But even in Tanakh itself, even within the Bible itself, we find a number of the celebration of Passover happening a number of different times in a number of different historical contexts. And yet there's one in particular that's very striking, which is the Passover that happens before there is a Passover. If we can scroll down, I think 3 slides. In the book of Genesis, we find an extended episode. This is going to be scene 3 in this story. We find an extended episode in chapters 18 and 19, where angels come down and visit Abraham and Sarah. Then they head down to the city of Stone and they destroy the city of Stone. We'll go through that episode in a minute, but there's one detail that jumps out of that extended episode that spans chapters 18 and 19, and that is when the angels come down to the city of Stone and they're invited inside the house of Lote, who is Abraham's nephew living in the city of Stone. Next slide, please. One more. Lote invites them in. He serves them a feast. This is in verse 3. He urged them strongly, so they turned and entered his house. He prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Why did they bake unleavened bread? What a strange detail for the text to add. Says Rashi, the medieval commentary Rashi on the text, he bakes unleavened bread. Next slide, please. We're 2 slides down. He bakes unleavened bread because, says Rashi, it was Passover. Oh. Slight anachronistic detail there. This midrash fits in with a genre of midrashim that see the forefathers as observing all of the commandments, even though the Torah, of course, hadn't been given and wouldn't be given for many hundreds of years. The value of this perspective on the forefathers, I will leave for somebody else to discuss, but note that it's particularly problematic here, given that the mitzvah, the commandment to celebrate Passover, not only was not given as a commandment, but makes no sense at this point in time because Passover, of course, is only to commemorate the Exodus event that had not actually happened yet. Leaving that slight problem aside again, and we think about the Midrash not as something that should be taken literally, but something that should be taken figuratively or perhaps literarily, and we can already start to see certain parallels between the story of Lot in Stone serving his guests unleavened bread, and the story of Passover in Egypt. Why, of course, do the Jews have matzah in Egypt? If you go back, I know there's a lot of scrolling going on here. If you go back to the first screen, we see that they serve matzah. They're commanded to bake matzah in Egypt because they leave Egypt in a great hurry. They don't have time to let their dough rise. Well, whether Lot knows it or not at the time that he prepares his guest's food, Lot is actually about to be in a big hurry to leave his home and to leave the city of Stone before it's destroyed. In other words, the detail of matzah is a kind of foreshadowing of what Lot is about to experience. So what I want to talk about in the course of this class is the parallels that we find between this extended episode in the book of Genesis, again, spanning chapters 18 and 19, and the Passover that the Jews commemorate or celebrate in the land of Egypt on the night of the Exodus, and the ways in which the themes that are expressed in the way that they celebrate the Exodus in Egypt are reflected and magnified and deepened when we read this series of stories in Genesis. Okay, let's go back to the second slide, to the beginning of scene 2. We'll go through just an overview of what happens in these 2 chapters in the book of Stone. As I've suggested in these slides, these episodes, this extended story of the angel's visit to first Abraham and then to Lot unfold in a series of 4 discrete scenes. The beginning of scene 1, Abraham is sitting at the entrance to his tent at the heat of the day. He sees 3 wanderers, 3 travelers in the distance. He invites them in. He serves them a very gracious meal. And then after they finish the meal, one of the guests says to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" He says, again, this is scene 1. He says, "She's there in the tent." And then the guest reveals himself not to be a simple guest, but in fact an angel of the Lord, because he says, "In a year's time I will return and your wife will have a son." Sarah is at this point 90 years old, or 89 years old. Abraham is 99, clearly past the time where they're able to have any more children. Sarah is quite taken aback. She laughs with skepticism. She says, "How could it be that God that I could possibly give birth?" And God is critical of the fact that she laughs. Okay, end of scene 1. Scene 2. The angels, two of the angels set forth for the city of stone. One of the angels stays behind and, speaking for God, has a debate with Abraham about the fate of the city of stone. In verse 16, the men set out from there and looked towards stone. Verse 17, now the Lord had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? And he tells Abraham that he's about to destroy the city of stone. And now Abraham utters the famous line, highlighted here in purple, will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? How dare you, the judge of all the earth, far be it from you, shall the judge of all the earth not deal justly? And then Abraham and God engage in a high-stakes negotiating game where Abraham tries to bargain God down in terms of the number of innocent people who have to be in the city of stone in order for the entire city to be saved. He starts with 50 and works his way down to 10. God says, that's my final offer, and he leaves. And Abraham is left wondering whether his bargain with God, that if there are 10 innocent people left in the city, that the city will be spared, whether his best effort was in fact good enough. End of scene 2. Scene 3, we find the two angels have come down to the city of stone. As we said, Lot invites them in, and Lot says to them, please partake of this meal. And in the middle of the meal, all of the townspeople come, surround the house, and demand that Lot send out his guests in order for them to sexually abuse. Lot goes out to the doorway, tries to convince them to leave them alone. He's unsuccessful. His guests, who are of course angels, pull him into the house, strike all of the townspeople blind, and then say to Lot, you have to flee. Lot hesitates. He's very hesitant to leave the city. Finally, they pull him out of the city with his wife and daughters, and they say, run to the hills lest you be swept away. His wife, of course, famously looks back and turns into a pillar of salt, and the city suffers its fiery demise. End of scene 3. And finally, scene 4 is a kind of addendum to scene 3. Lot and his daughters are now living in a cave because they think the world has been destroyed. And his daughters, the older daughter turns to the younger and says in verse 31, our father is old, there is not a man on earth to consort with us in the way of all the world. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may maintain life through our father. Seeing no other possibility other than to get their father drunk and rape him, his daughters do exactly that. They get pregnant by him, and their sons are the progenitors of two nations, of two great nations who end up having conflicts with the Israelites at later points in history. Okay, that's a basic outline of the story. This episode is actually one of the longest episodes, continuous episodes in the book of Genesis, and it's really tied together by the figures of the angels who first visit Abraham and then visit Lot. It's not actually clear what these stories have anything to do with each other. What's also interesting, though, is that for the biblical narrative, this is a very richly described, very richly detailed story. And I've highlighted in red throughout these slides some of the interesting details that we find in the story that are very rare for the biblical narrative. For example, if we turn back to scene 1, scrolling up a few slides, we find Abraham sitting at the door of his tent. Well, that's an interesting detail. We don't usually have very much in the way of setting. We just find characters. They don't actually, they're just out there. We have to imagine all of the scenery around them. If we were filming this biblical scene, the tent would be something very important. If you think about Schindler's List, I always use this image. I like to think about the biblical text as a kind of movie script. Think about Schindler's List, all of it is in black and white, except, of course, for one detail, and that is the red coat, which Steven Spielberg wants to call your attention to. It's worn by a little girl towards the beginning of the movie. And then, of course, tragically, you see the coat in a pile of coats in the death camp. Well, here, the tent, the mention of the tent, that innocuous detail is actually really interesting because we don't usually have very much in the way of setting. The day grew hot. We don't usually know what the weather was in the Bible. That's usually detail that we have to imagine. When Abraham invites his guests, he seats them under a tree. There's another setting detail that we don't usually have. We have a very richly described feast, which is also very unusual, and so on and so forth. Throughout this whole episode, we have, well, all of these stories, we have a number of interesting details that give us a very rich sense of the text. The detail that I want to call your attention to, or the set of details that I want to call your attention to, relate again to the setting. As I mentioned, there's this tent that Abraham's sitting at. He's sitting at the entrance to his tent. And as scene 1 unfolds, the tent becomes very important. The angels say to Abraham, "Where is your wife Sarah?" Again, highlighted here in red. And he replied, "There in the tent." Then one said, "I will return next year and your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Now, why is all this important? On a simple level, it's important because we need to know that Sarah is within earshot. This is when Sarah finds out that against all odds, in fact, against basic facts of nature, she's going to have a child. We need to know that Sarah is close enough to hear the conversation that's going on. But I want to suggest that there's another level on which the tent and the doorway are significant, and that's what we're going to talk about as we go forward. Because if we continue through the episode, we see that the tent is not alone as the only setting. In fact, we have a number of physical structures that are mentioned, again, in very unusual way within this episode. Scroll down to scene 2. We find Lot, again, at the beginning of the episode in the gateway to the city. Sorry, scroll down to scene 3. I apologize. We find him in the gateway to the city, where he greets his guests. He brings them home into his house. Well, okay, so he lives in a house, not such a big deal, except houses are not very often mentioned within the Bible. And the house is really important here, because as Lot and his guests are eating, the townspeople surround the house. And the house, of course, has a door, or an entranceway and a door. Lot goes to the entranceway in verse 6 and shuts the door behind him before he tries to convince the townspeople to leave them alone. The townspeople will not leave him alone. They said, "Stand back, the fellow. Stand back. The fellow came here as an alien. Already he acts the ruler. Now we will deal worse with them." They pressed hard against the person of Lot and moved forward to break the door. Then the men stretched out their hands, pulled Lot into the house with them. And the people who were at the entrance to the house, young and old, were struck with blinding lights. They were helpless to find the entrance. Again, the entrance and the house and the doorway are all details that are repeated and emphasized over and over in this episode. And then finally, in scene 4, we have a third closed space. Serves a very important function in the episode, which is the cave. Lot and his daughters find themselves living in a cave. There's a very interesting sequence then: the tent, the house, the cave, 3 closed spaces. The first 2 of them have doorways where we find characters standing at important moments. In other words, a whole set of detail, very unusual for biblical narrative, which says, "Darshani, explain what is going on here. Why does the biblical text emphasize all of these details? What's the significance, the literary significance of the tent, the house, and the cave, and the fact that both Sarah and Lot, at critical moments in the story, are standing in the door?" I want to explore this image of these images of the closed space in the doorway by going back to yet another story in the book of Genesis. Go back to the third slide, right after scene 1. This brings us back to an episode that happens in Genesis chapter 15, where there's a prophecy that Abraham is going to have many descendants. God has already brought Abraham from the land of Ur-Kasdim to the land of Israel, and he's promised him the land of Israel for his descendants, and yet Abraham is still childless at this point. And Abraham turns to God and says, Abraham said, "Further, you have granted me no offspring. My steward will be my heir. My servant's going to inherit me. I have nobody else to inherit me." In verse 4, the word of the Lord came to him in reply, "That one shall not be your heir, but none from your very own, but your very own issue shall be your heir. You will have a child," says God. He took him outside and said, "Look toward the heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said, "So shall your offspring be." The very famous prophecy that God said to Abraham, "Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars." Again, there's one interesting detail at the beginning of here. He said, took him outside. Okay, took him outside. No big deal, right? Because he needs to see the stars. Rashi, in fact, says he took him outside. Its simple meaning is he brought him outside his tent so he could see the stars. But it's interesting that at the beginning of the story, he's inside the tent, which is, of course, a detail the text doesn't tell us. And therefore, Rashi suggests that maybe there's another level of interpretation here. Its midrashic explanation is, says Rashi, step outside your astrological projections. Step outside of what you have seen as your fate in the stars. For you have seen in the constellations that you will not father a son. Abram will not have a son, but Abraham will have a son. Sarai may not bear a child, but Sarah will bear. I will call you by a different name, and your fate will be changed. This midrash is reflecting the fact that within the Abraham narratives, Abraham starts with one name, Abram, and then God changes his name in a few chapters to Abraham. Sarah's name at the beginning of the story is not Sarah, but Sarai. God changes their names, he says, and thereby changes their fates. The stars are not simply stars that signify the multitude of Abraham's descendants, but the fate that Abraham has seen. God shakes him outside and shows him the stars in an entirely new way. We see here then a dynamic between inside and out, which reflects what I want to call the dynamic of possibility. When Abraham begins this very short episode, he's inside the tent. He's inside the closed space, which represents the closed fate that he has seen for himself to live out his life childless. When God takes him outside, God is showing him new possibilities, new horizons, new things that Abraham never thought he could experience. And therefore, the dynamic of inside to outside, is a dynamic of feeling trapped and then moving to a world in which new possibilities suddenly open. If we go back now to scene 1, go one slide back to scene 1 in chapter 18, I think we can understand the dynamic of the tent and the doorway in a very similar way. Because of course, at the beginning of this episode, Sarah too is trapped in the tent. The tent, again, being the closed space that represents the one possibility that she sees for her life, which is to be childless. And of course, for a woman in a patriarchal society, being childless was essentially to be without identity. A woman's identity was tied to her motherhood. And therefore, Sarah psychologically, existentially finds herself trapped. The tent is, in fact, a prison. When the angel says to her, I will return next year and your wife Sarah will have a son, Sarah moves, not completely outside, but into the doorway. In the doorway of the tent, she can see not only Abraham and the angels enjoying their meal, but possibilities that she never thought existed. She begins that inexorable movement out of her prison, her psychological and existential prison, into a world where she can suddenly perceive something new, something she never imagined. And yet it's interesting that Sarah stops at the doorway. She doesn't go outside as Abraham did. She stops in the doorway, and I think that reflects something about the psychology of that moment. Sarah cannot fully embrace the additional possibilities, the beneficence that God has bestowed upon her at that moment. Instead, she perceives it, but does not yet go there. And instead, she responds with laughter. And Sarah laughed and said to herself, now that I am withered and told to have enjoyment when my husband is sold, how can this possibly be? She cannot yet accept it. The doorway then, that liminal space between inside and out, represents her frame of mind at this moment where she feels torn. She doesn't quite understand how this is possible, and she responds with skepticism, she responds with cynicism. God, of course, turns to her and said, is anything too wondrous for the Lord? I'll return to you next time, and Sarah shall have a son. And gradually, Sarah learns to accept that which she laughed at. But the narrative leaves us here. The narrative leaves us with Sarah in the doorway, Sarah not yet willing to accept what God has promised her. In that liminal space between the inside and out, where she can perceive the possibilities that she never thought of, but has not yet learned to embrace them. We now proceed to scene 2. We'll get to the cave, sorry. We'll gradually be moving there. Scene 2, we get to the house. In the house, we also find Lote standing in the doorway. And if the doorway represented something about Sarah's psychology, sorry, we move now to scene 3. We're going to skip over scene 2 and move to scene 3 with Lote. And if the doorway represents something about Sarah's psychology, the doorway also represents something about Lote's psychology. Lote is a man torn between conflicting values. He's torn on the one hand, he is a nephew of Abraham, somebody who invites guests into his home, welcomes them, gives them a gracious meal, And he is alone in the town in terms of being the only person who is willing to invite guests. And yet he's also somebody who is drawn towards, in a kind of bizarre way, toward the city of Stone and all that it represents. And therefore, at the moment when he has this conflict between the townspeople and protecting his guests, he stands in that doorway. And he can't really decide. What does he want? Does he want to side with the people of Stone, or does he want to side with his guests? You even see it in the detail that he suggests what his way to resolve this problem. In verse 8, he says, "Look, I have 2 daughters who have not yet known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you please." Not exactly the protective figure that we imagine Lot to be. In fact, Lot seems to have been severely influenced by his surroundings, where sending your women out into the world to be abused by the townspeople is an acceptable solution to a problem. Lot is very much torn between these 2 aspects of his personality, and therefore we find him in this liminal space in the doorway, not really being sure what to do. And Lot's hesitancy, Lot's tornness, we see as Lot goes forward, that as the story goes forward, the Lot continues to be torn. The people, the angels tell him, "You're going to have to flee the city. The city is going to be destroyed." He hesitates. He's not really sure what to do. And finally, in order to leave, the angels, as I said before, have to pull him outside the city. If you continue on to the next slide. Still he delayed, the men seized his hands. They pull him out of the city. When they had him outside, they say, "Flee for your life. Do not look behind you. Do not stop in the plains. Flee to the hills, lest you be swept away." And even then, Lot is completely helpless, completely powerless. He says, "Oh no, you've been so gracious to me. Just let me flee to that other city. I don't have the strength to flee to the hills." Lot is somebody who throughout this episode is torn, is helpless. And again, that psychology of Lot, of his character, is reflected, I think, very powerfully by the image of Lot standing in the doorway, not really being sure to go in or out, which way he wants to go. If we consider the image of the doorway and the house from the perspective of the people of Stone, I think it acquires even more significance. It's very striking that throughout this episode, the people of Stone are desperate to get inside the house to the guests. On the one hand, on the simple level of the text, they want to abuse the guests. They seem to be just rapacious with this grotesque sexual drive. On the other hand, I think subconsciously there's a sense that the townspeople have perhaps a sense they know the gig is up. And in order to prevent the destruction of the city, somehow they have to get inside. Even after the angels, if you go back to the previous slide, even after the angels blind them, they continue to grope for the doorway as if they know that this is the only possibility of their being saved. There is something, again, here about this dynamic of possibility that is going on in the city. But as opposed to with Abraham and Sarah, where possibilities are expanding, where God is allowing things that should not naturally be able to happen, suddenly to happen, in Stone, the opposite is happening. In Stone begins as a place where anything is possible, where anything you want can be immediately taken, where there are no limits, where there are no boundaries. The night that the angels come, seeing if the city should be destroyed, we know that as soon as they close the door, the fate of the city is sealed. Reality is about to collapse in on itself, and the vanishing point is the house. The house now becomes the only place where anybody is going to survive in the city of Stone. At the moment that the angels close the door, everybody who is outside the door is going to be killed. Everybody inside the house will be saved. The house, therefore, is no longer a prison. The house is now a sanctuary. Possibilities are now not expanding, but possibilities are rapidly contracting. Instead of a dynamic moving from inside to out, as we had with Abraham and Sarah, now there's a dynamic of going from outside to in. If before God was making things that should not have been possible suddenly possible as a measure of God's beneficence, here we find the very opposite. God is about to destroy the city by miraculous means. Reality is about to collapse in on itself. Something that should not naturally be able to happen, the sudden destruction of an entire population, is in fact about to unfold. And now we move to the third of these 3 closed spaces, which is the cave. And again, if we think about it in terms of the dynamic of possibility, the cave is a fascinating last episode. In the cave, of course, Lot and his daughters are essentially, they end the story in the cave. We never see Lot and his daughters again. The cave is the last place we see them. When I think of the cave, I think of my one and only time spelunking, actually in the land of Israel, and actually in the hills near Herodian, which is actually not far from where Lot and his daughters would have hidden out. And as opposed to a kind of cartoon cave with a nice big opening where you're sitting around a campfire, I imagine the cave being something like that time when I went spelunking, where you crawl through this tiny little crawl space and you find yourself completely enclosed in darkness. The cave is a closed space with no door. The cave is a place where there is only one possibility. It is a prison with no exit. Lot's daughters say there is only one possibility left, and there is no other man with whom we can have children. We have to do the unthinkable, to rape our father in order to perpetuate life on this planet. Do they really not know that there were other people around? We don't know, but the destruction that they have experienced has been so psychologically devastating, they think this is the only thing they have left. The dynamic of possibility, I see a lot of comments here. You can take this in any directions. The cave is a womb. The cave is many things. And the more you think about this dynamic of possibility, I think the richer your experience will be reading other biblical episodes where we have similar dynamic of closed spaces and doors. But the cave, I think, is a fascinating conclusion to the series of 3 closed spaces because it also speaks to this dynamic of possibility. Here, there's only one possibility, and there's no exit. The daughters of Lot and Lot himself are, in fact, trapped. There is, of course, an irony in the fact that the daughters of Lot do exactly what Lot proposed, which is to send them out to be abused by the townspeople. Now it is Lot himself who, in fact, will be abused by those very same daughters. I want to take a step back now and go back to scene 2, which is God's debate with Abraham, and see how it fits into this whole dynamic of possibility that we've talked about. We noted that Abraham here utters the immortal words. Abraham came forward and said, "Will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty?" How dare you, says Abraham. Let's continue what he says in verse 24. What if there should be 50 innocent within the city? Will you wipe out the place and not forgive for the sake of the innocent 50 who are in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you, shall the judge of all the earth not deal justly. Hatshofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Several of the commentators note, and I think this is a basic problem in Abraham's argument, there's a pretty significant inconsistency in what he says. On the one hand, Abraham is demanding strict justice. Strict justice means the innocent or the righteous should be saved and the wicked should be killed. And yet, when you see, somebody mentioned, sorry, many interesting comments here. I'm not going to get to all of them, but maybe we'll come back to some of them at the end. The significance of the fact that he says separate the wicked, the innocent from the guilty, should be that God saves the innocent and kills the wicked. And yet that's not what Abraham asks for. Abraham says, if there are 50 innocent in the city, you have to save the whole city. And eventually, as Abraham bargains God down from 50 to 10, he's left with a situation where there could be 9 innocent people in the city, but because there is not a 10th, the city is destroyed, innocent and guilty alike. The basic question then is, when Abraham says, will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty, why does he not ask for the innocent to be saved and the wicked to be killed? A number of commentators ask this question. It's framed really powerfully by Nachmanides, by Ramban, if you want to go back and look at his commentary. But the one commentator that I want to pick out who poses a really fascinating answer to this question is the Malbim, which is 2 slides down. Oh, sorry, here, right here. The Malbim says, the question regarding Abraham's demand that God not sweep away the righteous with the wicked. Why didn't he ask that the people in the city be spared on account of the righteous? Wouldn't it be enough for only the righteous to be spared? The Malbim answers as follows. For anywhere permission is given for the destroyer to kill, it does not distinguish between the good and the evil. This, of course, is what the Midrash in the Gemara said about the dynamic on the night of the Exodus, and the Malbim invokes it here to explain this dynamic. Abraham has an intuitive sense this is an all-or-nothing game, and that he cannot ask God, even as chutzpahdik as Abraham is, to demand that God save the city. Abraham is not chutzpahdik enough to demand that he save the righteous and kill the wicked. The first time I was preparing this material for a class, I was learning it with my chavruta, Jesse Kellerman, and I remember clear as day what Jesse said, which is, that's not how the world works. We are witness in our time and throughout history to many calamitous, tragic episodes where it seems that innocent people are simply swept away. We mentioned, of course, David mentioned, of course, Dr. Bernstein in the first session mentioned 9/11. The Holocaust, of course, jumps out as a terrible calamity where we don't understand why so many apparently righteous people were swept away. When I think about the 21st century, as Dr. Bernstein said, as a time of great uncertainty and instability, I think of the 2004 tsunami, where within a matter of hours, hundreds of thousands of people were simply wiped off the face of the planet. We don't understand why the world works this way, and yet we understand intuitively that it often does. We don't expect God to pluck the righteous out of every calamitous situation. We understand that there are calamities that sweep away the righteous and wicked alike. And this is, in fact, something that's highlighted in a number of places in the text, and somebody in the comments mentioned Aviva Zornberg. Aviva Zornberg has a beautiful, very moving essay about this in her book on Genesis, about the mode of sphia, the sweeping indiscriminate judgment. If you scroll one slide down to scene 3, Abraham, of course, said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? And then, as the angels pull Lot out of the city of stone, one more slide down, please. They say, flee the hills lest you be swept away. In other words, there's this mode of the sweeping indiscriminate judgment that even Lot, who has been plucked out of the city by divine intervention, cannot be guaranteed to escape. He has to run. He has to flee for his life. And this is, in effect, the mode of contraction of possibility that we find in the city of stone. Even though, by all natural expectations, the city of stone should be allowed to thrive and survive even in its wicked ways, God is about to contract possibilities, is about to destroy the city by supernatural means. And in the context of that destruction, there is going to be a sweeping judgment that may very well sweep away innocent people along the wicked. Now, we, the readers, know that there are no other innocent people, or at least innocent men, in the city, because all of the men in the town surrounded the house and demanded that he send out his guests. There is not one more innocent man in the city. And Lot and his family, who are presumably the only innocent people in the city, are in fact plucked out of the city, a point which is emphasized in the last verse in scene 3. Thus it was that when God destroyed the city of the plains and annihilated the cities where Lot dwelt, God was mindful of Abraham and removed Lot from the midst of the upheaval. Sometimes we find divine intervention that in fact does what we think should be done. And even though Abraham doesn't ask for it, this is in fact what God does to save the righteous and kill the wicked. But Abraham doesn't ask for that because he understands that that mode of exact, strict justice, shall the judge of all the earth not do justice, is very elusive. So elusive, in fact, that we can never ever bank on it happening. Reality always tends more in one direction or the other, either towards getting more than we naturally deserve or less than we naturally deserve. And this is a very troubling theological observation, but I think it's very true to the way that we experience reality. The city of stone experiences the sweeping indiscriminate judgment where God seems to sweep away the righteous with the wicked, even though it's not what the righteous deserve. But if we go back to scene 1, where God comes and tells Abraham and Sarah they're going to have a child, here is where God gives us more than we deserve, more than should be possible within the normal course of events. And God says, is anything too wondrous for the Lord? And therefore, when we think about this pairing of stories and the way that these stories are folded into this one extended episode, we understand that the series of stories is really about the full range of this, what I've called the possibility, the dynamic of possibility, from reality being much more than we ever expect because God's blessings rain down upon us, to much less than we expect because God sometimes engages in this mode of sweeping indiscriminate judgment, this mode of sfiyah. And Abraham is caught in the middle. Abraham, as the central figure in the story, as the one who engages directly debate with God, is caught not really understanding these two modes. Abraham's life, in a sense, is understanding the modes of giving up and getting more. If you think about, I don't want to go into it in too much detail, but if you think about the beginning of Abraham's journey toward the land of Israel, what does God say to him? Leave behind your family, leave behind your land, leave behind everything, and I will bring you to a great land where you will get much more than you ever thought you could get. Abraham's journey from the beginning of where we meet him up until even after the binding of Isaac is understanding this dynamic of giving up and getting more, of sometimes closing off certain possibilities as other possibilities are opening. Here he is caught in the middle. On the one hand, he and Sarah find themselves with expanding possibilities, and at the same time, he has witnessed, a first-hand witness to the destruction of Sodom, and he never really knows what happens. If you go back to the end of scene 3, we find, one was the end of scene 3. Next morning, Abraham hurried to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and looking down towards Sodom and Gomorrah and all the land of the plain, he saw the smoke of the land rising like smoke from a kiln. All Abraham knows is that he's failed. He doesn't know he's failed to save the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. He doesn't know actually what has happened to his nephew. For all we know, he never finds out. Nor does he know whether other innocent people perished. And therefore, the psychology of Abraham at this moment, I think, is a very interesting psychology in terms of understanding the character of Abraham. But in the moments that we have left, I just want to go back to the story of the Exodus, because I think this gives us tremendous insight into what is going on the night of the Exodus. Back to the first slide. Of course, in the Exodus, we said there's this commandment not to go outside because they might be smited. The night of the Exodus is a night where there is a terrible plague being visited on the Egyptians. It's a night not actually yet of freedom, but it's a night of terror and a night of foreboding. As the people sit down to their Passover feast, they understand very well that this is a night where calamity could strike them, and it's only because they're observing God's commandments that God will save them. Aviva Zornberg, in another essay in her book on Exodus, notes a very interesting detail here about how they're supposed to eat the Passover sacrifice. So they eat it with their loins girded, their sandals on their feet, their staff in their hands. Why are they hurrying? What's going on here? Where are they going? They're not going anywhere until the morning because they were just told they can't leave their house until the morning. Zornberg suggests that the point here is to create kind of a scene, to put them in a place where they have props, to get them feeling what they're supposed to be feeling. And the feeling that they want to have, that God wants them to have on this night, is a feeling of panic. The word that's translated here is hurriedly, is the chipazon in Hebrew, and chipazon has not only a sense of hurry, chipazon has a sense of panic and desperation to it. As the people are eating their sacrifice, they know what's about to happen. And as the Egyptians scream out as the plague is visited upon them, every instinct in them is to leave Egypt now. And yet they know that if they stay in their house, they'll be safe. The message on the night of the Exodus is that even as calamity is raining down all around you, God will save you. God is there for you. On the night of the Exodus, the house is, just as it was in Sodom, a sanctuary and a refuge, and all those who stay in their house will be saved. The doorway, then, is the space that cannot be entered, the space that the Egyptians perhaps want to enter, just like the people of Sodom wanted to enter that sanctuary and that refuge, but only the Israelites are there, and only the Israelites will be saved. The next morning, of course, the image of the doorway is reversed. And the house, instead of becoming a sanctuary and a refuge, now represents the prison that the Israelites have lived in for the past many hundreds of years of slavery. And as they leave Egypt the next morning, the door is, just as it was for Sarah, a doorway into expanding possibilities and new horizons, possibilities they never thought would happen, but now, thanks to God's beneficence, now they are a free people. So the doorway image, which is so prominent in the Exodus in Egypt, we talked before about images being painted red, as in Schindler's List. The doorway is literally painted red. It jumps out at us as an image from the text. The doorway image has this kind of two-way significance to it. The closed space on the night of the Exodus is a sanctuary and a refuge where God saves us amidst the calamities of history. And then the next morning, the doorway is a doorway to freedom. I won't belabor the point in terms of how this reflects on our contemporary experience, some of us being in quarantine, most of us being fairly immobilized, and preparing for Passover, perhaps unlike Passover that we've ever experienced before. And yet I think if we look at the Passover in Exodus and the significance of the closed space, we understand very well what it means for a closed space to be a sanctuary. And we hope that as we celebrate the Passover together, the doorway will then turn into a doorway towards freedom and well-being for us and for the rest of the world. I wish you a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a very happy, kosher, and healthy Passover.
Thank you so much, Yishar Kochacha, Daniel, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We'll be offering more opportunities in the days and weeks ahead to bring all of you, wherever you are, into our Beit Midrash at Pardes. Thank you so much for being with us. Good health and chizuk, strength and resilience to everyone.